Today, I want to share with you a story about silence. Not the comfortable silence of a sleeping house or the peaceful quiet of a church after the congregation has gone. No, this story begins with the kind of silence that has teeth, the kind you find high up in the Arizona desert, where the air is so thin it feels like glass. And the wind. Well, the wind up there sounds like a violin string pulled too tight, just waiting for a bough that never comes to finally snap it. This is where we meet Elias Thorne. If you were to see Elias from a distance, riding along the ridge of the Painted Canyon, you might mistake him for a part of the landscape itself. He was a man carved from the same stubborn oak and red rock that defined the territory. 50 years of life had etched lines around his eyes, not from smiling, but from squinting against the sun and looking for things that didn't want to be found. He wore a coat of faded canvas, dust-colored and stiff with age, and he moved with the easy, deliberate rhythm of a man who had nowhere to be and no one waiting for him. Elias was a tracker, though he hadn't pinned a badge to his chest in a decade. On this particular Tuesday, the sun was a white hole in the sky, bleaching the color out of the sagebrush. Elias wasn't hunting men. He was tracking a cougar, a big female, wounded by a rancher's trap miles back. He wasn't tracking her to kill her, but to see if she would survive, or if mercy required a bullet. That was the kind of man Elias was. He believed that even the wild things deserved a clean end. His horse, a roan mare named Bishop, twitched her ears, stepping carefully over the loose shale. They were descending into a dry wash, a scar in the earth where water only ran when the heavens opened up. But today, the wash was dry as bone. That's when he saw it. It shouldn't have been there. Nothing should have been there but rocks and scorpions. But about 100 yards down the ravine, overturned in the sand, lay a wagon. It wasn't a freight wagon, nor a stagecoach. It was a modest buckboard. Its wheels spun uselessly toward the sky, but it wasn't the wreck that made Elias pull Bishop to a halt. It was the color. Draped over the side of the splintered wood was a sheet of fabric, bright, screaming yellow. In the frontier, that color spoke a language everyone understood, from the illiterate prospector to the cavalry general. It didn't mean gold. It meant quarantine. It meant sickness, cholera, smallpox, the fever. It was a warning flag that said death is here. Turn back. Elias sat motionless in his saddle. The wind whistled through the canyon, tugging at the brim of his hat. Every instinct he had, every survival skill honed over a lifetime, told him to turn Bishop around and ride until the air tasted clean again. You don't mess with the sickness. It's an enemy you can't shoot, and you can't outrun. He tightened his grip on the reins, ready to leave. But then, the wind shifted. It carried a scent, not the sweet, cloying smell of decay or sickness, but something sharper. Copper, iron, freshly turned earth. And Elias Thorne was cursed with a conscience that was louder than his fear. He dismounted, his boots hitting the dust with a soft thud. He tied Bishop to a dead juniper tree, patting her neck. "Steady, girl," he murmured. His voice was like gravel rolling in a stream bed low. Rough, unused. He approached the wagon on foot, a handkerchief tied over his nose and mouth, his rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. The silence of the canyon felt heavier now, watching him. As he got closer to the wreckage, the story changed. The wood of the wagon wasn't just broken from the crash. Elias leaned in, his eyes narrowing. There, splintering the oak paneling, were holes, small, punched-in craters. He ran a gloved finger near one. Bullet holes. This wasn't an accident. And it certainly wasn't a quarantine. Someone had draped that yellow flag over the wreck not to warn people away from sickness, but to keep prying eyes from looking too close at a crime scene. Sickness doesn't carry a Winchester. Sickness doesn't chase a wagon off a cliff. Violence did. Elias circled the wreck. The horses were gone, cut loose, or stolen. The luggage had been ransacked. Clothes scattered in the dirt like colorful leaves. But there were no bodies. He crouched low, listening. The wind hissed. A lizard skittered over a rock. "Is anyone there?" he called out. His voice cracked slightly from disuse. Nothing. He stood up, exhaling a breath he didn't know he was holding. He was about to turn back to his horse when he heard it. A sound so faint it could have been the shifting of the sand. A scratch, like a mouse behind a wall. It was coming from beneath the overturned bed of the wagon. Elias moved slowly. He didn't want to startle whatever wounded animal was hiding in the dark. He knelt in the sand, gripping the edge of the wagon's wooden siding. "Easy now," he whispered. He braced his shoulder against the wood and heaved. The wagon groaned, lifting just a few inches, enough to let the light flood into the crawl space beneath. And there she was. She wasn't a cougar. She wasn't a child. She was a woman, curled into a ball so tight she looked like a stone. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, covered in the red dust of the canyon. Her hair, dark and matted with sweat, hung over her face. But it was her eyes that stopped Elias cold. They weren't the eyes of someone who had given up. They were wide, terrified, and burning with a fierce, desperate light. She was dehydrated, her lips cracked and pale, trembling with the kind of exhaustion that kills. In her hands, she clutched a leather bag. It looked like a doctor's satchel, worn and battered. She held it against her chest like a shield, like it was the only thing keeping the world from crushing her. "Ma'am," Elias said softly, lowering the wagon back down, but keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you." For a second, she didn't move. She just stared at him, measuring him, assessing the threat. She looked at his gun, then his face. Elias reached for his canteen. "You look like you need water. I've got some right here." He uncapped the canteen and extended his hand, moving slowly, inch by inch, like he was approaching a frightened mare. "Just take a sip. I'm Elias. I'm just passing through." She uncoiled. It happened so fast, Elias almost missed it. She didn't reach for the water. She lunged, with a cry that was half scream, half sob. She threw herself at him. She was small, weakened by the crash and the heat, but she moved with the ferocity of a cornered badger. Elias saw the flash of steel in the sunlight, a scalpel, small and deadly sharp, slashing through the air toward his face. She wasn't a victim waiting to be saved. She was a fighter refusing to die. Elias dropped the canteen. He caught her wrist, just inches from his cheek. Her momentum slammed into him, knocking him back into the dust. She fought wild and hard, kicking, clawing, trying to drive that small blade home. "Let go. Let me go," she rasped, her voice ruined by thirst. Elias didn't strike back. He didn't shout. He used his weight, rolling them over, until he had her pinned, not to hurt her, but to stop her from hurting herself. He held her wrist, firm. But he was careful. He could feel how fragile her bones were beneath his grip. "Easy," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a rumble in his chest. "Easy." Now, she thrashed once more. A final burst of adrenaline. And then her strength simply evaporated. The fight drained out of her, leaving her gasping, staring up at the sky, her chest heaving against the hard earth. Elias looked down at her. He didn't look angry. He looked sad. He gently took the scalpel from her loosening fingers and tossed it aside, out of reach. Then, he released her wrist. He didn't get up immediately. He stayed there, hovering slightly, creating a barrier between her and the sun. "The wolf doesn't eat the hawk, ma'am," he said quietly. It was an old saying his grandfather used to mutter. "You're safe. I'm not them. Whoever put you in this ditch? I'm not them." She blinked, tears finally cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the lines in his face, the sorrow in his eyes that matched her own. "My daughter?" she whispered. The words were barely air. "Lily." Her eyes rolled back. The exhaustion took her. Her head lolled to the side, unconscious. Before she could finish the name, Elias sat back on his heels, breathing hard. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold knot in his stomach. He looked at the woman, this stranger who fought with a surgeon's blade. Sarah Bennett. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew her spirit. He reached out to check her pulse. It was thready, fast. She needed water, shade, and rest, or she wouldn't see the sunset. He stood up and moved to lift her. As he did, his boot brushed against a piece of the broken wagon, siding a plank that had been hidden in the shade. The sun caught it now, burned into the wood, charred black and unmistakable. Was a symbol. It wasn't a ranch brand. It wasn't a maker's mark. It was a circle with a rising sun inside it, jagged rays reaching out like claws. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He knew that mark. He'd seen it in whispers in the trading posts, seen it on pamphlets nailed to church doors in towns where hope had run dry. The Church of New Dawn. They weren't just a congregation. They were a hunger. And they had been here. Elias looked down at the unconscious woman in his arms. He looked at the vast, empty desert that stretched out toward the border. He had gone out looking for a wounded cat, looking to offer a mercy killing. Instead, he had found a war. He adjusted his grip, pulling her closer to his chest. She was light, too light. "Well, ma'am," he whispered to the silence. "Looks like we've got a long ride ahead of us." He turned toward Bishop, leaving the yellow flag to snap and flutter in the wind. A lie telling a story that was only just beginning. The journey back to Elias's homestead was a blur of heat and hoofbeats, a fever dream, where the only constant was the steady, rhythmic breathing of the horse beneath them and the solid presence of the man holding the reins. When Sarah finally opened her eyes again, the blinding white sun of the desert was gone, replaced by the amber glow of lantern light and the scent of dry sage and pine. She wasn't in a cave, and she wasn't in a cell. She was lying on a cot, covered with a quilt that smelled of cedar chips and clean air. Elias's cabin was a surprise to anyone who might have stumbled upon it, expecting the den of a hermit. It was small, yes, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of iron. But inside, it was a fortress of order against the chaos of the wild. The floorboards were swept clean. Shelves lined the walls, not filled with trophies or weapons, but with books, leather-bound volumes of history, botany, and poetry that looked like they had been read 100 times. Beside them stood jars of dried herbs, labeled in a neat, cramped hand: yarrow, willow, mullein. This was not the home of a savage. It was the home of a man who was trying to remember what civilization felt like. Sarah watched him through half-closed eyes, too weak to move, but aware enough to be afraid. Elias was standing by the wood stove, his back to her. He had taken off his heavy canvas coat. He moved with a quiet efficiency, pouring hot water from a kettle into a ceramic basin. The steam rose up, curling around him like a ghost. He turned then, and Sarah flinched, her muscles locking up. But Elias didn't advance on her. He stayed by the table, dipping a clean white cloth into the water. "You've got a fever, ma'am," he said, his voice low, blending with the popping of the fire. "And that cut on your arm needs cleaning before the infection sets in." He approached the cot, but he didn't loom over her. He pulled a wooden stool over and sat down, bringing himself to her level. In his hands, he held the cloth and a small bowl of dark, bitter-smelling liquid. "Willow bark," he explained, seeing her eyes track the bowl. "For the pain, and a little honey, so it doesn't taste like regret." He waited for her to nod. A small, barely there motion. Before he reached out, his hands were large, scarred from years of wire fences and bridal leather. But his touch was shockingly gentle. He cleaned the grit from her forehead first, the warm cloth feeling like a blessing against her parched skin. He washed the dried blood from her arm, his movements precise and clinical, devoid of anything predatory. When he was done cleaning the worst of the wounds, he did something that told Sarah more about him than any words could. He stood up, placed a fresh pitcher of water and a clean shirt, one of his own, worn soft with age, on the chair beside her. "I'm going to see to the horses," he said, not meeting her eyes, giving her the dignity of looking away. "Take your time. There's a latch on the door if it makes you feel better. But out here, the only thing you have to lock out is the wind." He stepped outside, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving her alone with the warmth of the fire and the impossible realization that she was safe. Time moved slowly in the cabin. By the time the door opened again, the sky outside the single window had turned the bruised purple of twilight. Sarah was sitting up, wearing the oversized flannel shirt, clutching a tin cup of the willow tea. The pain in her body had dulled to a throb she could manage. Elias walked in, carrying an armful of firewood. He didn't ask how she was. He just checked the fire, then moved to the stove where a cast-iron pot had been simmering. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, simple food, beans and cured pork, and handed one to her. They ate in silence for a long time. It was a guarded silence, the air between them thick with unasked questions. Sarah watched him eat. He ate slowly, deliberately, like a man who respected the effort it took to put food on the table. Finally, she set her bowl down. Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping together. "You're not a rancher," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflective in the lamplight. "No, ma'am, not anymore. And you're not a doctor," she added, nodding toward the herb jars. Just a man who's bled enough to know how to stop it, he replied. He set his bowl down and leaned back, the wood of his chair creaking. You attacked me with a scalpel. Sarah, you move like someone who knows where the arteries are. So I'm guessing you're the healer. She stiffened at the use of her name. Then remembered, she must have mumbled it in her delirium. I'm a midwife, she said, lifting her chin slightly. And I know enough to know that men don't drag women out of canyons for nothing. I didn't drag you, Elias corrected gently. I carried you, and I did it because the alternative was leaving you for the coyotes. Now, you mind telling me why a midwife was hiding under a plague wagon with a brand from the Church of New Dawn burned into the side? Sarah looked into the fire. The warmth seemed to drain out of the room at the mention of the name. She wrapped her hands tighter around the tin cup, her knuckles white. It's not a church, she whispered. The anger in her voice was cold, sharp. It's a harvest. Elias stayed quiet, letting her find the words. Cyrus Vane, she said, spitting the name like a curse. He travels from town to town. He finds the widows, the women left behind when the mine's close or the fever comes through. He tells us he's a prophet. He tells us the end times are coming, that the fire is going to consume the wicked, and only his chosen will be spared. She looked up at Elias, her eyes hard and wet. He doesn't save us. He collects us. He convinces women to sign over their deeds, their land, their savings, for the cause. And then he packs us into those wagons and moves us before anyone in town realizes we're gone. Elias's jaw tightened. He had heard of snake oil salesmen, but this was a different breed of poison. So you ran. I tried, she said. A tear finally escaped, tracking through the clean skin Elias had washed. I realized what he was. I saw how he looked at the younger girls. I tried to slip away during the night, but they caught me. They put me in the sick wagon to punish me. Said I had a sickness of the spirit. They were going to leave me there to rot as a lesson to the others. You're free now, Elias said, his voice firm. Vane is miles away. No, Sarah said, and the word cracked in the middle. She dropped the cup. It clattered on the floor, spilling the last of the tea. She didn't seem to notice. She leaned forward, grabbing the edge of the blanket, her desperation filling the small room. I'm not free, she choked out. I didn't run to save myself. I ran to get help. Elias sat up straighter, sensing the turn in the trail. Help for who? My daughter? Sarah sobbed, the fight finally breaking under the weight of her grief. Lily. She's 15. She's still with them. She thinks he's a saint. Elias. She thinks I'm the sinner. He has her. She looked at him, her gaze piercing through his defenses. They're heading for the border. Vane said that once we cross into Mexico, the laws of men don't apply. He's going to vanish. And he's taking my little girl with him. Elias looked at the woman trembling on his cot. He looked at the medical bag she had fought him for, realizing now it wasn't just a shield. It was the only piece of her old life she had left to give her daughter. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the black night. He had spent 10 years hiding in this canyon, burying his own ghosts, telling himself that the world's cruelty was no longer his business. He was a scout who had lost his way, a protector with nothing left to protect. But the silence of the canyon felt different tonight. It didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. How far? Elias asked, his back still to her. 2 days ahead of us, Sarah whispered. Maybe less. Elias turned from the window. The shadows hid his eyes. But the set of his shoulders had changed. He wasn't the caretaker anymore. The softness was gone, replaced by something older, something harder. Get some sleep, Sarah, he said. He walked to the corner of the room and picked up a rifle scabbard, beginning to oil the leather with slow, rhythmic strokes. We ride at first light. The morning didn't break. It bled into the sky. A slow, bruising purple that promised heat before the sun even cleared the horizon. Inside the cabin, the silence was different than it had been the night before. It wasn't the silence of rest. It was the silence of a held breath. Sarah Bennett was moving before the light was fully gray. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her feet were blistered. Her arm throbbed beneath the bandages Elias had applied. And her head swam with the lingering dizziness of dehydration. But the image of her daughter, Lily trapped in a wagon, rolling toward a border that might as well be the edge of the world, pushed her forward. She didn't wake Elias. Or, at least, she thought she didn't. She grabbed her medical bag, her fingers trembling as she latched it, and pushed open the heavy timber door. The cold desert air hit her like a physical blow. She wrapped her thin shawl tighter and stepped off the porch, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. She took one step, then two, her eyes fixed on the faint trail leading south. She made it 10 yards before her knees simply gave up. She stumbled, catching herself on a fence post, gasping for air that felt too thin to breathe. You won't make the first mile, a voice said from the shadows. Sarah spun around, nearly losing her balance. Elias was standing by the corral, leaning against the rail as if he'd been there for hours. He was fully dressed, his canvas coat buttoned to his chin, his hat pulled low. Beside him, the roan mare, Bishop, was already saddled, her breath huffing white clouds into the morning chill. I have to try, Sarah said, her voice brittle. I can't sit here drinking tea while she gets farther away. I know, Elias said. He didn't move toward her, didn't offer a hand to steady her. He just watched her with that unreadable, stone-calm gaze. But look at you, Sarah. You're shaking. The desert doesn't care if you're a mother. It doesn't care if you're righteous. It'll kill you just the same. Then let it, she snapped, pushing off the fence post. I'm going. She took another step, defiant, but her leg buckled. She would have hit the ground if Elias hadn't been there. He moved with a speed that belied his age, catching her by the arm. He didn't pull her back. He just held her up. You can't walk to hell, Sarah, he said softly, looking down into her desperate eyes. It's too far. And the devil is faster than you. He turned her gently toward the horse. He checked the cinch on the saddle, gave the mare a pat, and then looked back at the woman who was ready to die on his doorstep. But I can ride you there. He lifted her into the saddle with an ease that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He swung up behind her, reaching around to take the reins. For a moment, she stiffened, unused to the closeness, to the wall of warmth his chest provided against the cold. But then, as he clicked his tongue and urged Bishop into a trot, she leaned back. She had to. She had no strength left to hold herself up. They rode out of the canyon as the sun set fire to the red rocks. The journey was a climb. They left the flat, dusty scrub of the low desert and began to ascend the rim, The landscape shifted around them, trading the dry, scratching brush for the deep, ancient silence of the ponderosa pines. The air grew cooler, smelling of resin and damp earth. The red dust turned to pine needles that muffled the sound of the horses' hooves. They rode for hours without speaking. It was an intimacy born of necessity. Sarah could feel the steady beat of Elias's heart against her back. She could feel the tension in his arms as he guided the horse over treacherous shale and fallen logs. He wasn't just a driver. He was a shield. By the time the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, blue shadows through the trees, they had reached the high country. Elias found a clearing near a small, trickling spring and pulled Bishop to a halt. "We rest here," he said. "Horses need water, and so do we." They made camp in the twilight. It was a simple affair, a small fire to chase away the mountain chill. A pot of coffee boiled, black and strong, and strips of dried venison. Night fell heavy and fast in the mountains. The stars didn't just appear, they exploded across the sky. So bright and close it felt like you could reach up and rake your fingers through them. The wind died down, leaving the fire to crackle and pop. The only sound in a world that felt vast and empty. Sarah sat on a log near the fire, wrapping her hands around her tin cup for warmth. Elias sat opposite her, cleaning his rifle. He did it by touch, his eyes fixed on the flames. The orange light danced across his face, deepening the lines, making him look older, more weary. "You know the trails well," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. For a man who says he's not a rancher, Elias paused in his work. He slid the bolt back into the rifle with a sharp metallic click. "I wasn't always a hermit." Sarah, she waited. She had learned that Elias was like a dam. You couldn't force the water. You had to wait for the pressure to break. He set the rifle down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. 20 years ago, I wore a uniform. I was a scout for the 3rd Cavalry. My job was to see things before they saw us, to know the land better than the Apache. He let out a breath, a short, bitter laugh. I was good at it. Or, I thought I was. I was young. And when you're young, you think you're immortal. You think you can outsmart the wind. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks, drifting up toward the stars. We were escorting a wagon train. Settlers, families, heading for Verdigris. There was a pass, narrow, rocky. My captain wanted to go the long way around. I told him I knew a shortcut. I told him it was clear. Sarah watched him. His voice hadn't changed volume, but it had grown tight, strained. "It wasn't clear," he whispered. "It was a trap. They were waiting on the ridges. We were in a bowl. Fish in a barrel." He closed his eyes. "I didn't just lose soldiers that day. My wife, Martha, she was with the train. She was a teacher. She wanted to see the territory." The name hung in the air between them. Martha. It was a soft name, a gentle name for a violent memory. "I watched it happen," Elias said, opening his eyes to stare into the heart of the fire. "I watched the rocks rain down. I watched the fire. And I couldn't do a damn thing but shoot and pray. And neither one did any good. I buried her there. I buried my badge there, too. I walked into that canyon you found me in. And I decided that if I couldn't protect the one person who mattered, I didn't have any business living among people anymore." He looked up at Sarah then. His eyes were dry, but they were filled with a hollow, ancient pain. I'm not doing this because I'm a hero, Sarah. I'm doing it because maybe this time I can get the wagon through. Maybe this time the mother doesn't have to bury the daughter. It wasn't heroism. It was penance. He was paying a debt to a ghost. Sarah looked at him, this rugged, the broken man who had carried her out of the desert, not for glory, but to silence the screaming in his own head. She saw the guilt that he wore like a second skin, heavier than his coat, tighter than his saddle girth. She set her cup down in the dirt. Slowly, she reached across the space between them. Elias flinched slightly as her hand covered his. His hand was rough, calloused, cold from the night air. Hers was small, warm, trembling slightly. She didn't pull away. She squeezed his fingers, anchoring him back to the earth, back to the present. It wasn't your fault, Elias, she said. Her voice was fierce. Quiet steel. You can punish yourself for 100 years in these mountains. You can live in silence until the dust covers you up. But it won't bring her back. Elias looked at her hand on his, then up at her face. He looked like a man waking up from a long, dark dream. She loved you, Sarah said. And you loved her. That's why it hurts. That's why you're still bleeding 20 years later. She leaned closer, the firelight catching the tears in her eyes. Grief is just love, with nowhere to go. Elias, she whispered, it's just love, with nowhere to go. Don't let it turn you into stone. Elias stared at her. For a moment, the only sound was the popping of the pine wood. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over and gripped hers back. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a lifeline. It was two people drowning in the same ocean, finally finding a piece of driftwood to hold on to. Get some sleep, he said, his voice thick. We catch them tomorrow. He didn't pull his hand away. Not for a long time. And high above them, the wind whispered through the pines, sounding less like a violin, string snapping, and more like a song finally finding its melody. The sun was a hammer against the anvil of the earth by the time they found them. It wasn't hard to track a caravan that believed it was guided by God. They left a trail of trampled sage and wheel ruts, deep enough to break an ankle. Elias and Sarah found the camp tucked into a box canyon, a three-sided prison of red rock, with only one way in and one way out. It was a defensive position. Smart for a general, but foolish for a man trying to hide. From the ridge above, lying flat on their stomachs among the hot stones, they looked down. 5 wagons formed a circle. Men with rifles paced the perimeter. Zealots, stiff with the self-righteousness that makes a man dangerous, because he believes his cruelty is a commandment. And there, in the center, sat Cyrus Vane. He was holding court on a velvet chair dragged into the dirt, reading from a book, while women, heads bowed and covered in gray shawls, cooked over a fire that gave off no smoke. Elias shifted beside Sarah. He moved his Winchester rifle inch by inch, settling the stock against his shoulder. His breathing slowed. He looked through the sights, calculating windage, calculating distance. I count 6 guns, Elias whispered, his voice devoid of emotion. Vane is the head of the snake. I take him. The rest might scatter. I take the guards on the ridge first. And we have the high ground. It was a soldier's plan. Efficient, brutal. Sarah's hand clamped over the barrel of the rifle. pushing it down into the dirt. Elias turned to look at her. His brow furrowed. "Sarah, we don't have time for a debate. If they see us, if you start shooting," Sarah hissed. Her eyes locked on the camp below. "They won't scatter. They'll panic. And the first thing cowardly men do when they panic is hide behind something defenseless." She pointed a trembling finger toward the women near the fire. "They'll use them as shields. Elias, they'll use Lily." Elias looked back through the scope. He saw the way the guards stood nervous, twitchy. She was right. A bullet would turn that camp into a slaughterhouse, and the innocent would bleed first. He eased the hammer back down. "Then we need a different way. But we can't just walk in there and ask politely. We don't have to ask," Sarah said, pulling her medical bag closer. "We just have to make them want us to leave." She opened the bag. Inside, nestled among the glass vials and bandages, were bundles of dried herbs: sage, sulfur, mugwort, things that burned thick and acrid. "Vane is a hypochondriac," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He preaches that the world is unclean, but he's terrified of germs. He wears gloves to shake hands. He drinks only boiled water. If he thinks the sickness I carried has followed him, if he thinks the air itself is poisoned." Elias looked at her, understanding dawning in his dark eyes. "You want to bluff a man holding a Bible and a gun. I want to scare him," Sarah corrected. "Fear spreads faster than cholera." The plan was madness. It was desperate, and it was the only chance they had. As the sun began to dip, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and bruise, they moved. Elias became a ghost. He slipped away from Sarah, melting into the shadows of the canyon wall. He carried no rifle now, only his knife and a bow he had unslung from his saddle. Silent weapons for silent work. Down in the canyon, the light was failing. The guards were getting complacent, watching the fire instead of the dark. Sarah waited until the first star appeared. Then, she lit the bundle of herbs she had prepared. It didn't flame. It smoldered, releasing a thick, yellow-gray smoke that hugged the ground, heavier than air. It smelled of rotten eggs and bitter earth. It smelled like sickness. She stood up, smoothed her torn dress, and began to walk down the trail, right into the mouth of the wolf's den. Inside the camp, the smell hit them before she did. The guards wrinkled their noses, coughing. Vane looked up from his book, sniffing the air, his face paling. "What is that?" Vane demanded, his voice high and thin. "It smells like brimstone. It's the plague." "Cyrus," Sarah called out. Her voice rang off the canyon walls, calm and commanding. She stepped into the circle of firelight. She looked like a wraith, pale, bruised, shrouded in the strange, curling smoke that trailed behind her. Every gun in the camp turned toward her. Hammers clicked back. "Don't shoot!" Vane screamed, scrambling backward in his velvet chair, covering his mouth with a handkerchief. "Don't let her blood spill. It carries the taint." Sarah didn't stop. She walked straight toward him, her eyes scanning the huddled women. "I told you." "Cyrus," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "You can't outrun the judgment. I brought it with me. It's in my breath. It's in the dust. You died." Vane stammered, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "We left you in the wagon. The sickness didn't want me." "Zara lead." stepping closer. It wanted you. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A girl, thin and pale, standing near the supply wagon. Lily. Her eyes went wide. She took a step forward, mouthing, "Mom, stay back," Vane shrieked. "Guards seize her. But don't touch her skin. Use the ropes." He looked to his left, shouting for his head of security. A brute of a man named Miller, who had been guarding the perimeter. "Miller, get her." Silence answered him. Vane looked to the right. "Johnson, where are you?" Silence. Sarah kept walking. She was 10 feet away now. "They can't hear you." "Cyrus." The sickness takes the voice first. It was a lie. But Vane didn't know that. He didn't know that 20 yards away, in the deep shadow of the canyon wall, Miller was unconscious, bound and gagged with his own belt. He didn't know that Johnson was currently staring up at the stars, terrified to move, because an arrow had pinned his coat sleeve to a mesquite tree. Elias was moving through the camp's perimeter like a sudden frost. He didn't kill. He didn't have to. He struck from the dark a blow to the temple, a chokehold applied with surgical precision. He was dismantling Vane's power structure brick by brick, leaving the prophet alone on his stage. But Vane was cornered, and a cornered rat bites. He realized suddenly that no one was coming. He realized Sarah was unarmed. The fear in his eyes hardened into malice. He snatched a revolver from his belt and leveled it at Sarah's chest. "You're lying." Vane snarled. The handkerchief fell from his face. "I see it in your eyes. You're not sick. You're just a mother." He cocked the gun. "And I'm going to send you to hell right here in front of your girl." Zara froze. She was 5 feet away. Too far to grab the gun. Too close to miss. She looked past Vane, toward Lily. "Run, baby," she whispered. "Nobody runs," Vane shouted. His finger tightened on the trigger. Thwack. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a wet, heavy sound, like an axe hitting a stump. Vane screamed, dropping the revolver. He clutched his right hand. An arrow fletched with owl feathers had struck the wooden stock of the pistol, shattering the grip and jarring the bone of his hand. So hard, the weapon flew into the dirt. "I wouldn't reach for that." A voice rumbled from the darkness. Vane spun around, clutching his throbbing hand. Elias stepped out from behind a wagon. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like Judgment Day. He held the bow loosely in one hand. Another arrow already knocked on the string. He was covered in dust, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, his eyes reflecting the firelight like two burning coals. "Who are you?" Vane gasped, looking around for his men. "Where are my guards?" "Your guards decided they had pressing business elsewhere," Elias said calmly. He pulled the bowstring back, the wood creaking audibly in the silence. The arrow was aimed squarely at Vane's chest. "You're alone." "Cyrus," Elias said, "look around you." Vane looked. He saw the women standing up, fear turning to anger in their eyes. He saw his hired guns missing from their posts. He saw Sarah Bennett, who had walked through fire to get here, picking up his fallen revolver from the dust. The psychological weight of it crushed him. He wasn't a prophet anymore. He was just a small man in a dirty suit, standing between a mother and a scout who hadn't missed a shot in 20 years. Sarah didn't look at Vane. She dropped the gun into her bag. She didn't need it. She walked past him, shoving him aside with her shoulder as if he were nothing more than a dry tumbleweed. She ran to the supply wagon. Lily collided with her, sobbing, burying her face in Sarah's neck. Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her so tight her own bones ached. "I've got you." Sarah wept, rocking her back and forth. "I've got you, Lily. I'm here." Elias didn't lower the bow. He kept it trained on Vane, who was now trembling, holding his bruised hand, watching his kingdom of lies crumble into the dust. "Start walking, Vane," Elias said, tilting his head toward the open desert, where Vane stammered, "There's nothing out there but coyotes." Elias finally lowered the bow, his expression hard as the canyon stone. "Then you better hope they're not hungry." Dawn didn't bring the heat this time. It brought justice. When the sun finally crested the canyon walls, it illuminated a camp that had been broken not by violence, but by truth. Cyrus Vane sat bound against a wagon wheel, his hands tied with the same rough rope he had used to bind so many others. He was silent now, his prophecies withering under the cold, hard light of day. Elias didn't wait for the marshals to arrive, though he had seen their dust cloud on the horizon an hour ago, a signal he had sent up with a mirror from the ridge before the raid began. He knew the law would take care of Vane. The women were free to take the wagons back to the lives that had been stolen from them. They had their own road to travel. But for Sarah and Lily, the road led back the way they came. The ride back to the homestead was slow, but the heaviness was gone. Lily rode behind her mother on one of the liberated horses, her head resting on Sarah's back. Asleep, Elias rode ahead, his posture different now. The invisible weight he had carried for 20 years, the weight of that ambushed wagon train, of the wife he couldn't save, had finally lifted. He hadn't just saved a stranger. He had made peace with his own ghost. A week later, the silence of the painted canyon had changed again. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of growth. In the patch of earth beside the cabin, where only dry sage had grown for a decade, Sarah and Lily were kneeling in the dirt. They were planting a garden. Not flowers, those were too fragile for this land, but squash, beans, and hardy peppers. Things that knew how to survive a drought. Things that put down deep roots. They weren't packing to leave. Sarah had nowhere to go back to. And perhaps she had found the only place that understood the kind of quiet she needed. Elias sat on the porch, his old rocking chair creaking, a slow, steady rhythm. He held a piece of cedar in his hands, shaving off curls of wood with his pocket knife. He wasn't carving a weapon. He was carving a small bird for Lily. He paused, blowing the sawdust from the wood, and looked up. Sarah wiped her brow with the back of her hand and looked toward the porch. There were no grand speeches. There was no sudden embrace or wedding bells ringing in the chapel. That's not how the desert works. But there was a look that said, "I see you." A look that acknowledged the scars they both carried, and the understanding that they didn't have to carry them alone anymore. It wasn't a happy ending. It was a new beginning. And out here, that was worth more than gold. Elias went back to his whittling, a faint, rare smile touching the corner of his mouth. The wind whispered through the juniper trees, but it no longer sounded like a violin string about to snap. It sounded like a breath being released. The desert takes many things: water, life, hope. But sometimes, if you fight hard enough, it gives something back. Thank you for walking this trail with me today. I hope Elias and Sarah's journey resonated with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Elias's choice at the end? And where are you listening from? Today, I always love seeing our community stretching from the front porches of Texas to the mountains of Montana and beyond. If this story moved something in you, please leave a like. It helps more folks find our campfire. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Echoes of the West and ring that bell so you never miss a tale. Until next time, keep your fire lit and your eyes on the horizon.